So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you Benji and Shanti for getting us started this morning. On behalf of FMC, our Congressional Study Group on Japan and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA, thank you everyone for tuning in. My name is Pete Weichlein and I'm the CEO of the Former Members of Congress Association, which has conducted the Congressional Study Group on Japan for over 20 years now. We are especially appreciative of the many guests who are joining us from Japan. You are either staying up really late or getting up incredibly early to join us, and we appreciate it. And we'll do our very best to make this conversation as interesting as possible to keep you all awake. Today's presentation is made possible via our partnership with the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. And I want to thank Dr. Satohiro Akimoto, Chairman and President of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA, for his years of invaluable support of the Congressional Study Group on Japan. Satohiro-san, without SPF, there would not be the hugely successful Congressional Study Group on Japan as we know it today. And I thank you so much for all your support. For our audience members, please note that we'll reserve the final third of today's panel for questions from the audience. If you could please pose your questions in the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen, include your name and organization, and we'll then have Shanti read them to our panel. And we'll try to get to as many questions as possible from the audience. Now, let me briefly introduce our panel. In the invitation flyer you all received, you can find a much more detailed bio, and I'll simply introduce them as follows. Congresswoman Susan Brooks, a Republican from Indiana, served in the House from 2013 to 2021. Congresswoman Elizabeth Esty, a Democrat from Connecticut, served in the House from 2013 to 2019. Congressman Ryan Costello, a Republican from Pennsylvania, served in the House from 2015 to 2019. And last but certainly not least, Congressman Gil Cisneros, a Democrat from California, who served in the House from 2019 to 2021. Thank you all so much for giving us your time and expertise today. And I should note that Susan Brooks caught a little bit of a cold shoveling over a foot of snow in Indiana, so she'll disappear once in a while to take a sip of hot tea, but you are being a real champion for joining us, even though you're a little under the weather. Thank you. So let me get us started. We are charged with giving our very unique insight into the first 100 days of the 117th Congress. And to start our thinking off on the most challenging foot possible, let's take a look at the first 46 days of that Congress and see what we can discern for the next 54 days until we reach that magic mark of 100. In the past 6 weeks alone, this Congress has voted to impeach a current president, switched majorities in the Senate, voted to remove a current member from all her committee assignments, held an impeachment trial, and voted to acquit a former president following said impeachment trial. So it's been, let's just say, an active 6 weeks for the 117th Congress. To think through possible legislative accomplishments, whether within the first 100 days or the first 100 weeks, we assume a willingness to govern and work together towards solutions. So let me ask each of you, what is the atmosphere right now in Congress, a place that two of you left just a few weeks ago? And how likely is it that we'll see a productive 117th Congress? Elizabeth, if you don't mind, let's start with you, and then Susan, Gil, and Ryan after that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Pete, and thank you to Sasakawa for their support for the Former Members Association and the really vital connection between the legislative branch in the United States and our friends and allies in Japan, and really appreciate your work on that. Now, I started with Susan. I traveled and served with Ryan as well. Susan and I have been friends now since we first got elected. And Gil, unfortunately, I did not serve with you, but hear great things about you. I think we are all, as you will see, we are all very collegial. Several of us are actually very good friends. But I do think the current Congress is, as I can see, I think, noteworthy and not in a good way, of a very high level of stress and real questions about whether people can trust each other. And that's a rather fundamental baseline concern. So I am deeply concerned about that aspect. Having survived and lived through representing Newtown, Connecticut with a school shooting, one of the features that no one's talking about, but I know is happening, is that current members of Congress are going through PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and their staffs are too. And they do not begin to know how much that's disrupting their sleep, their ability to think, their ability to plan. And so that's the sort of thing that is going to make it more challenging, plus all the politics, plus COVID. But I am most concerned, frankly, about that trust issue. And so I'm really eager to hear what Susan and Gil say about that, because that I'm hearing anecdotally, but wasn't on the ground a few weeks ago, and the two of you were.
Yeah, Susan, you left just a few weeks ago. These, for the most part, are colleagues of yours. So describe the atmosphere.
Well, thank you, Peter. And again, thank you. I want to echo what my good friend Elizabeth just said. Dr. Akamoto and Sasakawa Peace Foundation, thank you so much for the partnership with the former members of Congress. I was fortunate enough to have traveled to Japan in 2017, and I will share with you that those types of trips, those transatlantic trips, those trips across the Pacific are so important for members to travel together and to be together. But because of COVID, I will just say that we have not been together as a body. Because of COVID, the House chose to, and our speaker chose to allow members to do what is called proxy voting for the first time ever, and to give their vote to someone else. Republicans chose not to do that. I'm a Republican, so we went in to vote. But what that did is it removed us from each other. Just being together in the House, in the Capitol, being together in committee meetings, that was taken away during COVID. And I certainly appreciate why, because of the health concerns of many of our members. But I think this new Congress coming in with all of these new members, they really are not getting an opportunity to work with each other, to get to know each other, to learn what other's agendas are, except in Zoom hearings and meetings, which I understand they are. One committee meeting went until 5 a.m. One committee meeting went until 1 a.m. These are very difficult ways to govern and to legislate. And I think the first 100 days have already proven to be so incredibly difficult. And so I agree with Elizabeth, they probably will be, and their staffs will be suffering tremendously from the attack on the Capitol. And while that should be something that could bring us together, because we're remote, we really are not together. And it's, I think, going to be a very difficult time bringing this Congress together in not only the 100 days, but beyond.
And Gil, like Susan, you just left a couple of weeks ago.
Yes, and first, I just want to thank everyone again for your support for the former members of Congress as well. And thank you for including me in this event today and giving me this opportunity to speak with you all. You know, kind of like what Susan said, the atmosphere there, I don't think is very good right now, and it is very limited. And it was kind of going that way before. You would hear the stories from former members from like back in the 80s or the 90s about how everyone used to live in DC and everybody had friendships across the aisle. I mean, that has been kind of going away for a long time. I think your access, you know, you try and build friendships, but even with the way the schedule was going, Monday to Thursday, you were out, you would fly in on Monday, you're out of there by Thursday. There wasn't a lot of time to really kind of spend with a lot of members, really, especially across the aisle, even let alone in your own party. That has been going away. And right now, you know, you look at the Capitol and talking to my colleagues that are there right now, it's almost like a military kind of state that we're in. The Capitol is surrounded by fences. The area is all closed off. There's National Guardsmen there in the Army that are there with their M16s that are out. It's not the Washington, D.C. that I knew as a congressman, or even the Washington, D.C., and I went to college in D.C. It is so different right now. And now, again, with the schedule, it's changed because of the pandemic. They're spending less time in Washington. So that means less time to build relationships. Right now, I think they're doing 2 weeks from talking to a colleague yesterday, they're doing 2 weeks back in their districts, doing Zoom committee hearings, and then they go back to DC for 2 weeks, and they're just kind of rotating the schedule. So I think the potential there to kind of hurt what can get done, hopefully, on a bipartisan basis is at risk because people aren't just there to build those relationships and talk to each other like it had been in the past.
Ryan?
Sure. Nice to be with you. See my buddies Susan and Elizabeth. I'll say three things here. One relates to how you go about getting bills sponsored. Two involves January 6th, and three involves reconciliation. So if I forget, somebody needs to remind me, those are my 3 points. First, the way you go about getting legislation moving in a bipartisan fashion is to find colleagues on the other side. For Democrats right now, a lot of them are only willing to introduce bipartisan legislation if you are a member that voted to certify on January 6th, which whittles down the number of available Republicans to do bipartisan legislation with. I'm not questioning, the wisdom or the decision to do that, just merely pointing out that Democrats are looking at House Republicans in particular, kind of in two buckets. January 6th was an extremely damaging day in the history of our country. But it also has very present day ramifications for how members are interacting with one another, and even more importantly, how the staffs of members are interacting with one another. And as my former colleagues and Gil, whom I've never met before, but as they will all attest, you're only as effective as your staff, and your staff, they are facilitative in their own right. And if they are uncomfortable or not wanting to work with certain member staffs, it's very difficult to get the ball moving in that direction. I deal with a lot of offices right now because I consult, and I can share with you that most members that I talk to will say that this is the absolute worst time it has ever been on the Hill. And that I think is an accurate statement. What is going to get done this year, just to conclude, the Democrats will use reconciliation for a COVID relief bill. That will probably happen in the next month. You'll see a little bit, you'll see a lot of spending. You'll see a little bit of tax reform in there. And then there'll be a second bill over the summer. I think the outstanding question is whether or not infrastructure, as the term is used, will be part of that second COVID package, or whether that will be separated out and they'll try and do a big infrastructure bill separate and apart from it. One final point, the one thing that could bring everyone back together a little bit is if they do what the public calls earmarks and what members of Congress and their staff call congressionally directed appropriations. There has been some talk of that. I'm still deeply skeptical that happens, but if that happens, you could all of a sudden see members wanting to vote yes because they have important projects that are in bills that they can go back and explain to their constituents that they got things done.
And Ryan, I'm glad you mentioned COVID and the bill that the White House is trying to formulate and push through, because I mean, we can all agree getting vaccine into arms, finding ways to open our schools safely, shoring up the economy, helping people pay their bills. There isn't a partisan issue here about this must get done, but it still looks like it might be a bill that's going to be wholly Democratic, or one or two senators, Democratic senators, that may not vote for the bill, but it looks like it somehow has become a partisan issue. And I know a big piece of that is spending, but explain to us what the discussion right now is on the Republican side when it comes to what President Biden is hoping for and what the Republicans are willing to give.
Well, I'm sure I'll say what my colleagues here will say, and that is, and this is not a critique of Democrats, but reconciliation is a political process. So when Republicans did it 2 years ago, I'm sure Elizabeth could attest that there were some things in our tax reform bill that she could have easily supported, but she can't support the whole package. And so you have to go, it's going to be a huge bill, and it's going to be Democrats support it and Republicans don't. And what happens there is the coalition building happens on the Democratic side. So you need to make sure you get all Democrats on board in order to usher that through. That's the nature of it. And I think that you could do a COVID bill right now that could get unanimous. You could do a COVID bill right now that everyone in the House would agree to. The problem is there are a lot of folks, Republicans and Democrats, that will hold their vote in order to get more. And so they're a no unless they get more. And so then when they get what they want, that means some other people who were yes will all of a sudden be no. So it's a game of addition and subtraction that, that's what being in leadership is all about, dealing with all that stuff.
And Elizabeth, sorry, go for
I
it.
might just add briefly, one of the other issues that I think is a real problem for the Republicans with this COVID package is the amount of unspent funds that have already been appropriated in the previous packages that we passed. And Gil and I were both there. We came together very quickly in March to pass the CARES Act. And then we passed another bill that took longer, far longer than it should have taken, quite frankly. We should have gotten it done in the summer, and we didn't get it done until December. But billions upon hundreds of billions of dollars have been allocated and appropriated already that have not yet been spent. And I think it's a challenge for our state and local governments, maybe to get that spending, get those funds out the door. But I do think that is a huge problem. And that is why Republicans are reluctant to throw $1.9 trillion more dollars in what is not appearing to be a targeted way. So that's, I think, one of the other big issues. And so we need to get that spending happening of the funds we've already appropriated.
And Elizabeth, I think I saw you nod your head, but that may have been many statements ago. So,
well, much I agree with Ryan's assessment, but I did want to talk about some of the dynamics around reconciliation. Reconciliation is a one-shot deal. You do it and then it's gone. And I think, as we've all discussed, the level of trust is at an all-time low right now. So on the Democratic side, I think President Biden observed, as Vice President Biden, that Barack Obama tried very hard, wanted kumbaya, as we say. He wanted to try to get agreement and felt like he got burned, felt like he wasted a lot of time in 2009, 2010, and ended up still not getting any bipartisan support on ACA, burning his political capital, losing the House. And I think Joe Biden learned that lesson. And I think he is trying to keep together a fractious, diverse caucus on the Democratic side and to get some things done, because it could not be tighter. I don't think there's been a Congress that has been as evenly balanced between the parties. So the likelihood that President Biden will be facing both a Democratic Senate and a Democratic House in 2 years is not high. Historically, it would be very low that would happen. So that then intensifies the pressure to say, if we are going to get some things done that could be done through reconciliation, we must get them done, because otherwise we may never get them done. And I think the lack of trust plays into that right now, in feeling like, you know what, and he's a process person. Joe Biden is a process person. He would rather do it, quote, the right way, but he also understands where things are. He's a realist. And I think that is what's pushing Ron Klain. I've known for 35 years. I know a lot of these players. I think they learned what happened in the Obama administration and perhaps may overcorrect. I think there's a risk of that. And also, the states are just a mess. I know our state is fighting right now about, how do you take the COVID money? Can you use it now? Is it displacing? And I think that is making it very difficult between the states and federal government to try to figure out how to do what everybody wants. Get shots in arms, have it safe to go out, have kids in schools, open up factories, go back to movies. Everybody wants the same thing. It's a question of the order in which we do that. and who gets credit and who gets blame. And unfortunately, those last two questions are still more salient than I wish they were.
And Gil, let me pick up on that notion of spending your political capital. Clearly, COVID is the #1 challenge we must address. But let's just pretend for a lovely minute that we live in a normal world where COVID is taken care of and the economy is shored up, and President Biden and his administration can focus on some big ticket items, a piece of legislation that a distinguished panel 10 years from now is going to talk about. Where might be some possibilities here? Is it transportation? Is it infrastructure? Is it environmental policy? Again, in a perfect world, where might some of the political capital go right now?
Well, I think the one area where, when I was there, we talked about, the Republicans talked about, that was something that we all know the country needs and the country wants is an infrastructure package. We know we have roads that need to be fixed, bridges that need to be fixed. Talking to a colleague the other day, we were talking about this infrastructure package also to include Wi-Fi, to make that accessible to areas that don't have it around the country. This needs to be done, and this is, I think, an area where I think we can come together and start to work together. The issue where I think it always tries to get torn apart is how are we going to pay for it? Right? Are we going to have to raise the federal gas tax in order to do that, or what other ways can we do this to get it done? But I think we need to start moving in that direction. This is something that we all want. On both sides, it's something that the country wants, and it's something that's going to help put a lot of people to work with good paying jobs. And I think we can go and move in there, and we need to start working in that direction in order to get it done and figure it out.
And when it comes to earmarks, how many of you were in Congress during the heyday of earmarks? I think they all went away before you ever got to the place. I certainly remember from talking to the former members who were there during earmarks who said that was the way. That's how you got things done that you could point to when you ran for re-election, when you came home to your constituents. That was the way leadership could convince you of the wisdom of certain votes. And that's not part of the equation right now. So looking at leadership, looking at Nancy Pelosi on the Democratic side, Kevin McCarthy on the Republican side, and I think Ryan mentioned this already, this is a pretty challenging caucus on both sides of the aisle with a fairly diverse political point of view included in the caucus. How are they managing that right now? And again, if the end goal is to have a productive 117th Congress that will move the country forward, what's leadership? What's the challenge right now to get us to that point, Susan?
I thank you for the question, because there is a roadmap that one of my last assignments, I was on a completely bipartisan committee called the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. It was led by Representative Derek Kilmer, who is still there, a Democrat from the state of Washington. He did a fabulous job leading this bipartisan group, and Representative Tom Graves, who did retire, as did I. But I will tell you, we came up with 97 recommendations, bipartisan recommendations of how to improve the institution of the House of Representatives. And one of our top recommendations was bringing back what we called congressionally directed grant program, which is a different term for earmarks or congressionally directed funding, but it would make it a competitive process. We actually spent a fair amount of time about how to bring back earmarks, but in a reformed way, so that it would not be viewed as a corrupt process and would allow each member would have to get some support from the other side of the aisle for this to come forward. That is the type of way that I think we can really build the trust that Elizabeth is talking about that is lacking, and try and get some things done, particularly what Gil was just talking about, anything having to do with infrastructure, whether it is broadband, roads, bridges, railway systems, ports. If a member can bring that funding back home, that is something that is just not only good for them and their reelection, but most importantly, great for their constituents and their districts and the country. And that's what we need to do to be competitive in this country. And I really think that congressionally directed grant program that was a recommendation of 14 members of Congress in a bipartisan way, they should pick up that mantle and run with that recommendation.
And sorry, Elizabeth.
This is something I had been vice ranking member of the Transportation Committee in my last session and worked closely with our good friend, three of us, good friend John Katko. We were the co-chairs of that and worked extensively. And frankly, we're baffled that the Trump administration didn't run with our proposal. We met with them numerous times, and I suspect they, in retrospect, regret that they did not. I'm sure the Obama administration regretted that they did not. Now, during the Obama administration, though, John Boehner was opposed to earmarks. So if the Speaker of the House is opposed to something, it's not going to happen, period. This Freedom Caucus has been opposed to earmarks too. So you have to deal with, on both sides of the aisle, you have to deal with your internal dynamics and wrestle that to the ground. I don't know where Kevin McCarthy is on this. I was actually just reading this morning, Steny Hoyer, who's number 2 on the Democratic side, is a longtime fan of them because, for the reasons we're discussing, you have to give people a reason to vote for tough things for their district. And right now, and I applaud the work Susan and Derek and the whole group in the Modernization of Congress did, and we did a similar effort on the Former Members of Congress Association, actually did interviewing and debriefing of former members and came to much of the same conclusion. We need to change some of the rules and incentives. And right now, frankly, for fundraising and attention, you get that by being unreasonable, getting on TV, pounding the podium, shrieking at the top of your lungs and saying hell no to everything. And you get nothing for abiding by the rules, biting your tongue, taking tough votes. You lose your seat when you do that. So right now the incentives are terrible. The incentives need to be changed. People have focused on money. I think that's even harder to fix, getting money out of politics. But I do think things like encouraging and incentivizing bipartisan legislation, privileging that for introduction, doing things like having district-directed spending money, which currently is done by the president. I mean, it's an insane system in which Congress has the power of the purse, but has ceded all of that to whoever happens to be in the White House. That ought to be something members of Congress can agree on, but not if they're going to weaponize it in ad campaigns against the other side. And that's what I'm sure Nancy Pelosi is trying to figure out. She's very strategic. She's trying to figure out if this can be done in a way that gets things done without it becoming fodder for every campaign ad that takes out the majority she needs to be in the speaker's chair. And that's, I'm sure, the calculation she's trying to make right now.
I very much appreciate the plug for FMC's report. It's called Congress at a Crossroads. We interviewed 4 former members about their experience in Congress, and you can find it on our website, www.usafmc.org. So nicely done, Elizabeth. Thank you. Ryan, let me switch our discussion a little bit. Earmarks give you the chance to point at something, a bridge, a building, a post office, whatever it is back home. It's much more difficult to explain to your constituents foreign relations, international relations, trade issues, and these are votes that don't resonate quite as much with with constituents, whether it's Pennsylvania, Indiana, California, or Connecticut. But in the past 4 years, the Trump foreign policy has definitely taken a pretty hard stand on some long-standing relationships, whether it's NATO and our allies, and also, more importantly, almost trade relationships. We walked away from TPP, and as I mentioned at the beginning, we have a large audience joining us from Japan. We walked away from TPP, and that instead became the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, and without the US as a signatory. So looking at our allies in that part of the world, particularly vis-a-vis China, where are we now with the new administration and the 117th Congress? What are some opportunities here where we might be able to, get back in the game, so to speak, or at a minimum, shore up our relations with our partners in that region as we look at China and what China is doing economically and from a security point of view?
So it's a great question, and I would certainly be curious to see what Gil and Elizabeth have to say on this, because central to any trade deal is the ability to do trade promotion authority, and TPA is a really difficult vote for a lot of Democrats. In fact, I recall in my first term, the Obama administration, they relied on Republican votes in order to make sure they got TPA to the finish line, because it's a very, labor does not always view TPA authority in the most favorable light. Look, I think, I'll answer a question you didn't ask, and then I'll give it back to you. I think on the issue of tariffs in particular, I'm very curious to see how this administration dials back and remains a trading partner that's looking for better deals, but does it in a way that is a bit more productive and less damaging, frankly, to a lot of American industries. I think that's probably the first challenge for the Biden administration. But, I think it's a real question mark on how the administration goes about navigating trade deals, because historically with Democratic administrations, you're really looking to those middle of the road Republicans to help you get the votes in order to get things done.
Yeah, Gil, on walking away from TPP, did we set China up to be the driving force now in that part of the world?
I believe we did. And like I always say, the world is a better place when the United States leads. And unfortunately, I think during the last administration, we kind of walked away from that a little bit. Reaching out to a friend yesterday at the White House, I know that one of the top priorities is to make a bigger stamp there on the international right to rebuild these relationships. The president has said that climate change is going to be something that we need to start working on. So he's joining the Paris Accords now. We need to start building these relationships back up again, not only in Europe, but also in Asia, where a lot of, in Southern California, we depend on a lot of trade with Asia. Honda has its headquarters here in Southern California. These are relationships that we need to start building up again. We need to start becoming a factor again and kind of building these relationships, whether it be Japan, South Korea, China. We need to reach out and make sure that we are working with them to get fair trade. That's going to benefit not only our allies, but also, the people here in the United States.
Susan, let me take a step back again and ask you about the 117th Congress, which is the most ethnically and racially diverse Congress that has ever been assembled, building up on the 116th Congress, which was the most ethnically and racially diverse Congress that ever came together. And of course, a large number of women candidates, outstanding candidates on both sides of the aisle who were elected in the 116th and to the 117th. Between the two elections, 2018 and 2020, there are now 160 new members, I believe. And it's probably a little bit more true on the Democratic side, but it's not untrue on the Republican side, that you have become a Big Tent party when it comes to different experiences and different points of view. So what does that tell us about the focus of the 117th Congress and the ability of the parties to be more reflective of what we see in the country as far as our population is concerned?
You are so right that this Congress, 117th Congress, is probably the most diverse group of members that have ever been a part of the United States House of Representatives. In the last Congress, the Democrat Party did a phenomenal job bringing a historic number of women to Congress. In this last election cycle, the Republicans brought the most number of women we've ever brought to Congress, as well as the most number of candidates of color and new members from incredibly diverse backgrounds. In fact, we had a number of candidates who won election this year whose primary message was fighting socialism, and who came, even my successor was born in the Soviet-controlled Ukraine. And Representative Victoria Spartz, she came to this country about 20 years ago. We have a number of new members of Congress that were born in other countries or who are first-generation Americans. And so their experiences are very different than my own. And they have stories to share that they did share on the campaign trail. And I think that made a difference. I think there is a serious concern in the country about socialism and about socializing, whether it's our healthcare system, whether it's our energy system, whether it's any of our systems. And these people had the ability to share the story of what it was like growing up, whether it was in socialist countries or communist countries. And I think those messages resonated. I think, quite frankly, an opportunity that this Congress has is to come together to figure out our strategy involving China. And if we, along with our partners in Japan, which are so critically important, do not have a lot of common strategies relative to the rise of China, particularly with respect to technology and with respect to, our concerns around national security, I think this is an opportunity the Republicans and Democrats must come together, whether it's with respect to competition, national security, technology. There's so many things that I think we could agree upon in how we view China and in the policies that we have going forward relative to China.
Let me just remind the audience that in just a couple of minutes, we'll give you a chance to be part of this conversation as well. So please, I know I've seen 1 or 2 questions already in the Q&A part of the bottom of your screen, but please keep them coming. And we'll get to that in just a couple of minutes. Elizabeth, if I may pick up on what Susan just told us about the makeup of the 117th Congress. I mean, one thing that surprised me a little bit when I watched election results come in a couple of months ago, I thought in states like Florida, the Democratic message would resonate much more with the Latino community than it ended up actually doing. And I think a lot of folks like myself who think they know what they're talking about would have thought of the Latino American community being an opportunity for the Democratic Party to capture and build on as the foundation of the future for the party. So Elizabeth, would love to get your point of view on that, and of course, Gil, yours as well. For the Democratic Party, as they're expanding their voter base with the Latino community, also Asian Americans, are there opportunities there that didn't quite come through in 2020?
Absolutely. But that's in part because no one wants to be thought of as part of a group in that way. And I think there has been, I have been trying to fight within the Democratic Party an assumption, a lazy and wrong assumption, that somehow the Latino vote is absolutely, when kids get old enough and register to vote and turn out, it's game, set, match. There was, a few years ago, there was this demographic argument, right? Democrats are going to crush because you have a more Black and brown skinned population growing in the United States. I always thought that was lazy and wrong, because it does not pay attention to the enormous diversity of life experience and cultural values and preferences, and the diversity of the United States, frankly. And so it's very different if you come from a Cuban American background, and what you have heard is the stories from your family of what happened in Castro's Cuba. That's very different than if you were a migrant worker in Southern California in the Central Valley, which is again very different if you are Spanish speaking but Argentine and moved to the United States. Those are all very different experiences. And I think that the Democratic Party needs to be much more attentive to the great diversity, and I think is recognizing that, but isn't there yet, to the great diversity within the Latino community, and recognize, frankly, it's people want to see progress. And the extent to which Donald Trump got, I think, to everyone's lights, a shockingly high percentage of vote in the Latino community across the country, and larger in the Black community than people would have predicted, goes to show like people's color of their skin does not determine their vote. People are looking for a lot of other things. And if someone is culturally or religiously identified with you, if you're a small business owner, that may be the most important thing in your life. And so people should never make the assumption that the color of somebody's skin is going to determine their vote in and of itself. Policies matter, policies matter. Language matters, of feeling whether you're respected. Hey there, speaking of a young one, the future. So I think, it's things like just learning Spanish. More members of Congress learning Spanish so that they can communicate with members in their district. The final thing I wanted to make a quick plug on, both I agree on China, and I actually think there's a mutual reset across the parties, which may open some possibility in some ways, that both parties have kind of agreed we've got to all be much tougher on China. I think that actually opens up some possibility to revisit our relationships in Japan and South Korea in particular. But I do think we're going to have to really think about the need to get to know the diversity of the United States. I've been calling for and trying to find other, and I'll talk to my former colleagues here, to look to try to support people going to each other's districts that are very unlike their own, whether it's within your own caucus, like Democrat to Democrat or Republican to Democrat, because frankly, the country is extremely diverse and people don't know what they don't know.
Yeah.
You know your own district, that's your job.
Mhm.
But other people's district, they may be accurately representing their own district when they take a completely different position from you. And that's something that we don't have enough of a sense for right now. We don't know each other well enough, and people aren't friends enough to see and spend time in somebody else's district to say, wow, some of these values are the same, but the way they're manifested is really very different. I understand now why you took that vote.
Yeah. And Gil, we just saw two future voters. Help us understand that a little bit better. The Latino vote from one election to the next is going to be larger and more important and build up from one cycle to the next. What resonates from the Democratic side as well as from the Republican side? And what's a unifying factor here?
Well, well, first those two boys, those my twin boys, Christopher and Alexander, they're off to camp right now. I know it's a small little thing that they're going to do with the kids and with the pandemic and all, but they're doing it safely. But I think Elizabeth was kind of right on, right? It's especially when you look at the Latino community, it's not just one group. It's made up of individuals that come from countries all over Latin America that have different experiences, and we can't look at them as just one group. And the other thing too is that you have individuals like myself who've been here. My family's been here for generations. Unfortunately, and I hate saying this, and this is the one thing that one of the mistakes I say in my life I screwed up, is that I didn't learn to speak Spanish when I was younger. It wasn't something that was taught to me by my parents. So my father spoke Spanish, my mother didn't, and so it kind of got lost, and we're trying to kind of regain that with my boys. But you have individuals who are Latino, but they've lived in the United States for generations, their family has, and they don't necessarily think as the same as, immigrants that are coming here to the country, have only been here for the first generation. And so these are experiences that we need to kind of look at, right, and talk to these individuals and understand, look, immigration is an important issue that we need to deal with in this country. And I tell Democrats a lot when they're talking to the Latino community, they think that is the only issue that's important to them. And it's not. We need to talk more about education. We need to talk more about jobs to the Latino community. And it's the same thing with the Asian community as well. Here in Southern California, we have a large, Asian population where issues are very different. But as you see, right, as the generations get further and further deep into the United States, those Asian American communities, those individuals that have been here 3 or 4 generations, don't necessarily think the same way as their parents or grandparents do. And these are the issues that I think, whether you're going to be a Democratic Party or a Republican Party, you need to kind of look at the individuals and how they're dealing with it. And you just can't really think of it as a group.
So let me now reserve the rest of our time for some questions from the audience. And Shanti will read questions as they've come in the chat function. But I want to give our very first question, and he just appeared on screen, to an honored guest that we have joining us all the way from Japan, the Honorable Iwahi Huri. And if I pronounce that horribly, I hope you accept my apologies. But you're a member of the Japanese Diet. You're a member of the House of Councilors, which is the upper house in the Japanese Diet.
Yep.
You're also up in the middle of the night, so we appreciate it, and the floor is all yours.
Yep. Thank you very much. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you very much. It's 1:50 a.m., but I'm very grateful for this great opportunity to learn more about how the Washington D.C. runs and goes. Thanks to this great discussion, I really appreciate that Hori, the member of the upper house of the National Diet. Today, I learned that thanks to this wonderful discussion, that the Latino community will become larger in terms of the political power in the future in your country. It is very informative for me. Por eso estoy estudiando español aquí en Tokyo. Anyway, I have a question about the foreign policy, especially on China, and on 2 aspects. One is the national security, and another is an economy. First, in terms of the economy aspects, you were talking about the TPP. So now Japan and China and Australia and some other countries reached an agreement on RCEP, Regional Economic Partnership Agreement. And China has a desire to hop into TPP as well. But we do want to have the United States get back to TPP. We always keeping the door open for the United States. So how the current Congress and the new administration would feel about the possibility of getting back to TPP, the energy. The other one is about the national security aspect. Now the growing military power of China is a great concern here in the Asian region. And so allied effort between Japan and the US, and even with like-minded countries, the partners such as Australia and India, the joint operation would be indispensable for keeping the South China Sea stable and East China Sea peaceful, for just tackling with China's unilateral military actions by force. So do you see any policy change on the national security aspect, or just you will be consistent on the national security against China's unilateral conduct? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. Really appreciate it. And again, thank you for joining us. Ryan, if I may, since you touched on China earlier in our conversation, do you want to comment on the two parts of the question, China specifically and national security policy in the Biden administration generally?
Sure. And I think Elizabeth really summarized it best when she said, for both parties, a reset on what China policy will be is already happening. If it hasn't already happened with Republicans, I should say. I think Democrats still have to flesh that out a little bit. I think most Americans view our policies towards China through the lens of what it means domestically for our economy, and don't really think very critically about what it means from a national security perspective. Those that do, I think, really would put it in the same bucket as Russia, North Korea, and cybersecurity espionage. I think that the American public and a lot of politicians view it more through an economic leverage type relationship. And that's why you have these populist strands, both within the Republican and the Democratic Party, which, by the way, are not going away. And I actually think that the real challenge for thoughtful Republicans and thoughtful Democrats is to be able to channel that or make your policies and positions and deliver them through the lens of some populist rhetoric in order to keep the base of each party happy. That's a real defining challenge, in particular for I can say Republicans in the coming years. But to the point about what I think the Biden administration may do in this space, I don't think that from a national security perspective, there is that much difference from one administration to the other. The rhetoric might be different, and certainly, the Trump administration was extremely disruptive in some ways, but I think that there was a lot more stability behind the scenes, not spoken about, on the handoff between Obama and Trump, and now from Trump to Biden. And, say this about Biden, the man is stable. He's been in Washington for a long time. He is going to appoint well, hire well. And I think you're going to see, if there's going to be disruption in this administration, it is going to be planned disruption, unlike the Trump administration, where who the heck knows why that happened, right? So I think, for those that are tuning in and have certain interests where this administration's response from a national security perspective might be extremely concerning, or extremely important, I would just say be prepared to know what's going to happen before it happens, and be prepared for a very rational reason why that is the case.
Shanti, I know I've done a horrible job time management wise and have left us with 3.5 minutes for audience questions. Is there another question we can get to before we wrap up?
Yes, we do have one question, and this is from Hannah Proctor, who is a project specialist at Our Secure Future. And Hannah asks, what does the creation of the Gender Policy Council in the White House tell us about the ways in which gender will be integrated throughout the Biden administration? How can we make sure that a gender approach is also adopted by the 117th Congress?
I will defer to either Susan or Elizabeth to answer that question.
Well, I think you can just look at the appointments in the cabinet to see President Biden, as president-elect, pledged to have half of his cabinet be women and or people of color, and that is a pledge he honored. You see that with a lot of senior appointments. There's a very strong and deep commitment. And he personally, having a wife who has gotten a doctorate and has taught during his entire time being in the Senate, is somebody who really believes in strong women being an integrated part of public policy in the United States. So I think you're going to see the administration make a very full-throated commitment to not just placement of people in positions, but policies. And I think one of the policies we haven't talked about that we might see really is around child tax credit, earned income tax credit, childcare policies, because that is, again, it affects so many tens of millions of Americans that they can't pay for their childcare, and you aren't going to be able to have a thriving economy, which is consumer driven, unless people are working. And women have disproportionately dropped out of the workforce because of COVID. So there's absolute, and because of caregiving responsibilities around COVID. So I think that may be an opportunity for things to happen. I wanted to just say one quick thing on what Ryan was talking about. The appointments you're going to see, and have already seen, like Kurt Campbell as an extremely experienced person who's going to be handling a lot of the Asia issues. You're going to see more experienced, known quantities who are ambassadors at senior levels. Tony Blinken is going to do the same thing. So I think there's going to be a lot more calm and predictability and desire not to stir the pot if necessary. But it is going to be a huge, let me say, it is a huge pivot from Obama having really pivoted to embrace China. That is a big pivot, and we're not going back. It may adjust some back, but China's behavior has been such that I think we do now have bipartisan agreement to be very wary about China's behavior. And you're going to see both parties readjusting how we deal with China, but it's the biggest market in the world. And so we can't ignore that either. So it's going to continue to be a challenge.
So sorry, Susan, go ahead.
I just wanted to add, with respect to China, for those who are listening, and I wish it could have been bipartisan in the last Congress, but the Republicans did put together, and it's a 125-page China task force report that Ranking Member Michael McCall, who leads our Foreign Affairs Committee and used to be head of our Homeland Security Committee. There are 125 pages of ideas, recommendations, and findings after an investigation about various different issues relative to China, to answer your question, from national security to the economy to technology and so forth. And I think it's a great starting point also for the Democrats in Congress now to look at this report, find what things that the Biden administration, the Democrats agree with this report. We're out of an election year this year, and move forward on some of these recommendations. I think, and along with obviously the assistance and our tremendous friendship with Japan in finding ways to help us move forward on these recommendations, together we'll be far stronger.
So if I could just jump in here real quick too on China, like I think Elizabeth said perfectly, right? That it's a huge market, right? And a lot of Southern California and the nation really depends on trade with China. I know that the tariff war that we have in China hurt a lot of businesses here in my district that I represented, and all throughout the country. But they are, I was on the Armed Services Committee, and they are the biggest national security threat as well. They are building up their military. Their actions in the South China Sea are not friendly. And so it is something that we are definitely keeping an eye on. And that is not going to change from this administration, from the last. It is definitely, they are definitely our biggest growing national security threat. With the threat to our military and our country, and that's something that we need to be mindful of moving forward. And as far as when we talk about the gender going into this administration as well, and this will be the last thing I will say, the Equality Act is something that I know the Congress is focused on in regard to gender identity and making sure that we're represented and supporting our LGBTQ community. So that is something this Congress will move forward. It moved forward on the last one. It'll move forward with this one. And I think it'll have support from the administration going forward as well.
And we have run out of time. I'm sure we could continue this for quite some time longer, but unfortunately we I need to conclude. I want to give Susan Brooks my thanks and gratitude for sticking with us, even though you're a little under the weather. And also am very impressed that you had that China report literally at your fingertips. That's well prepared. Thank you so much. Gil, thank you so much for joining us. Ryan, really appreciate the insight. Elizabeth, thank you so much also for your leadership of FMC as part of our board. Let me thank the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA for being a terrific partner, not just on this program, but in general. Benji and Shanti from their team were outstanding. Lorraine and Miles from my team made all this happen. Thank you and appreciate it, and have a great rest of the day. And for you, Congressman Iwaho, have a good night. Goodbye.